Hello there, are you someone that likes to bet every single UFC fight to make watching the event more interesting? But on cards like we've got this weekend, you really struggle because we've got so many fighters making their debut, so many fighters that have only had one or two fights in the UFC, that you're just not familiar enough with many of the fighters on this card to know what to expect from most of these matchups. If you look through this card top to bottom, there are a lot of names here that, unless you're putting a lot of time into researching the fights, you won't really know what to expect. And we all live busy lives, right? You're probably out working really hard. You don't have time to put hours and hours and hours into researching a card like this. But you still want to bet it this weekend because you love watching the UFC, you love betting on the fights, and you want to be placing some bets that give you a pretty good chance of winning, right? You don't want to get destroyed. At the very least, you don't want to lose too much. Gambling's entertainment after all, and you want to bet some fights this weekend, have a little bit of fun. If you're someone like this, then you might want to consider checking out my website, MMABettingTips.com, because even though in this video today we're going to be going into a lot of depth on the main card fights on this card, there's still a ton of prelim fights that you're probably going to be watching and you're probably going to want to bet. And obviously, I don't have time to go into every single prelim fight on this card because this video would end up being over 3 hours long. But if you are someone that wants to bet some of these fights, just know that over on my website, MMABettingTips.com, you'll find breakdown videos for every single fight on every single UFC card. And I go into these fights in a lot of depth. These are not, opinions that I'm sharing with you. What I'm actually doing is summarizing the hours and hours and hours of research I've put into researching these fights over the past week. So you can essentially look at these videos like they're strategy guides. So if you want to bet a fight like Mick Parkin versus KO Mercado this weekend, and because Parkin's only had one fight in the UFC, and because Mercado's making his debut, you might not know what to expect. You can watch that video and then, maybe get some ideas for some bets you'd like to place. We hit a nice big winning bet last weekend on Lupita Godinez, which was a prelim fight. And also, if you sign up to my website, you gain access to our Discord channel where I share all my bets on every card. We talk about a lot of stuff, betting on other sports, obviously betting on MMA. You might get a lot of value out of it. So give it a try. Link in the description below, MMABettingTips.com. You can sign up here, check it out. Might be something you're interested in. But for now, let's get into breaking down these main card fights. And essentially what you'll find on the website is me going into the same level, breaking down the prelims as what I do when we break down these main card fights. So we're going to kick things off by breaking down the main event matchup between Brendan Allen and Paul Craig. It is a bit of a strange event, bit of a strange main event, not going to lie. I don't feel either of these guys are that close to the title picture. I don't feel it's a particularly good stylistic matchup that is going to create like a really exciting, entertaining fight. But it is what it is. We've got Paul Craig and Brendan Allen in a main event. Strange fight, but let's dig into it. So if we start off by taking a look at the odds on this one, we can see that Brendan Allen is a pretty big favourite at average odds of around 1.23, which is going to be minus 434 for an implied probability of 81%. If we take a look at the odds on Paul Craig, he's around an average of 4.30, which is going to be plus 330 for an implied probability of 23%. So Brendan Allen is 27 years old, 6'2", with a 75-inch reach. Paul Craig, 35 years old, 6'3", with a 76-inch reach. So both guys roughly the same size. There is a big difference in age. Brendan Allen is 8 years younger than Paul Craig, which statistically gives him around a 67% chance of winning. The younger fighter wins around 67% of the time when there's an 8-year age gap in a fight. Of course, this fight is at middleweight, which is important to point out because Paul Craig, in the majority of his UFC fights, has competed at light heavyweight, but he did drop down to middleweight for his last fight against Andre Muniz and was able to get the win. Very, very nice. So this fight's at middleweight. Both guys roughly the same size. Now, this is a matchup where I do see a lot of people this week that are considering a bet on Paul Craig. And I do understand the logic behind it, because whenever you've got two relatively low-level fighters, I don't want to be disrespectful to neither Paul Craig nor Brendan Allen, but I think we can all agree there's a lot of issues in the skill set of both guys. Whenever you've got two fighters such as this, in a main event, 5-rounder, and you see a big favourite in Allen, big underdog in Craig, it can be very tempting to take the underdog for big value in a matchup where neither guy is particularly good. I do understand that logic, and I think a lot of the time that logic makes sense. But every once in a while, you run into a stylistic matchup between two guys where I just look at it and I go, do you know what? With how both of these match up stylistically, I don't really see any way in which one of these dudes wins. And that's really how I feel about Paul Craig. It's really interesting because we've obviously seen Paul Craig pick up wins against all the odds against guys that, you know, we never would have given him a chance against, right? You know, guys like Jamal Hill, guys like Magomed Ankalaev. Paul Craig is someone that finds ways to win, and you can never count him out because of that. But when you look at how these two match up stylistically, we know, generally speaking, if Paul Craig's going to win, it's through catching a Hail Mary submission, putting a guy away, right? It's very unlikely you're ever going to see Paul Craig outstrike a guy in that top 10 ranking picture, or, you know, outgrapple someone over 3 rounds. If Paul Craig wins a fight, it's usually under opportunistic circumstances where he catches someone in a bad position and submits them. So that's the problem that I have with this matchup. When you consider how these two match up stylistically, it's one of those fights where I give Craig virtually no chance of winning. Because if we look at every area that this fight could take place, I mean, let's first of all talk about cardio, right? Before we even get into positions and technique. So Brendan Allen's one of these guys that never gets tired. He's blessed by an ability to fight at a high pace, to sprint, and not slow down. So Allen's a bit of a cardio machine at this level. Whereas we have seen Craig slow. He does get tired and sloppy in many of his fights, and the harder you make him work, the faster he's going to get tired. So Craig is someone that is going to struggle in a 5-round fight. There's just no way, no way to dress it up. Now, we know both these guys are primarily grapplers. Allen started as a BJJ guy at Rufus Sport. Craig's definitely a BJJ guy. So if we focus on how they match up when it comes to striking, that's going to be quite easy to go through. The grappling's a little bit more complex. We'll get into that in a minute. In terms of striking, again, I give Craig virtually no chance here. He doesn't really have much power in his hands. You know, we have seen Allen knocked out in the past, but Craig's not particularly dangerous. And Allen is a tough dude. Like, he's got a granite chin. He's tough. He's game. He's scrappy. We've seen him hurt in fights, recover, come back into them and manage to win. And Allen's one of these guys that's also making big improvements from fight to fight, whereas at 35 years old, you wouldn't expect Craig to be, improving. You'd expect him to be plateauing now. And Allen has got a really nice kicking game. He's got heavy, powerful, nasty, damaging body kicks that Craig isn't particularly well equipped to defending himself against. And when those body kicks start to land, they're just going to accelerate the rate at which Craig will slow. So I think Allen, huge advantage when it comes to cardio, huge advantage when it comes to striking. So then we consider, the other area this fight could take place, which is on the ground. How do these two match up when it comes to grappling? Both have bases in BJJ. Now, I think one of the main reasons why people attempted to bet on Paul Craig in this fight as a big underdog is because there's a lot of issues with Brendan Allen on the ground. He makes a lot of mistakes. He gives up position a lot. And people rate someone like Andre Muniz as a very high-level Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt. So the logic would be, if Craig is capable of finding a way to beat a guy like Muniz, Muniz is at a higher level on the ground, therefore, logically speaking, perhaps Craig can cause Allen problems on the ground as well. But you really have to consider how Craig needs to win this fight to get his hands raised. And in my opinion, he needs to submit Brendan Allen. Because in a 25-minute contest, with how much we've seen Paul Craig slow down every time we've seen him, by the time a fighter's got to the third round, even if Craig were to find a way to do really well in the first and second round, if Allen were to make loads of mistakes on the ground and Craig were to find a way to dominate him in those first 2 rounds, I think Craig would be too tired to outwork and outpoint Allen in the third, the fourth and the fifth round. And that is even if Craig is able to win the first 2 rounds, which isn't that likely considering Craig doesn't have the best offensive wrestling and Allen has a big advantage on the feet. But in my opinion, it is very unlikely that Craig is going to be able to outwork Allen in 3 out of the 5 rounds to take a decision. Because like I say, Allen's got the huge advantage when it comes to striking, significantly better cardio, and he can hold his own on the ground as well. Now, if we talk about how likely it is that Paul Craig catches Brendan Allen in a submission on the ground, for me, it is extremely unlikely. I know that Allen doesn't train at Rufus Sport anymore, but he did start his career at Rufus Sport and he trained there for a very long time. If you know anything about Rufus Sport fighters, you know even those Rufus Sport guys like the Pettis brothers, for example, who are predominantly strikers, they are very slippery on the ground. They have amazing submission defense. I don't know what the BJJ program's like at Rufus Sport, but it's virtually impossible to submit these guys on the ground. Just their brand of fighters, they're extremely difficult to submit on the ground. Their takedown offense isn't particularly good. They're not particularly great off their back. There's a lot of issues with Rufus Sport guys on the ground in that they give up position a lot. But in terms of submitting them, that is an incredibly difficult thing to do. Been watching the UFC for 20 years, and I can tell you right now, if a guy who trained at Rufus Sport for a long period of time, he's going to be a fucking nightmare to submit on the ground. The only realistic way you're going to submit a Rufus Sport guy on the ground is if you knock him down and you jump on top of him, jump on a choke before he has a chance to recover, or if you get him tired to the point where he can't defend himself on the ground. When we look at this fight, both those things are unlikely to happen because Allen is a cardio machine, so he's not going to get tired to the point he can't defend himself on the ground, and Craig's not particularly dangerous on the feet, so the chances of a knockdown pretty unlikely. If we're talking about the probability of Craig catching Allen in a submission in just an open grappling exchange on the ground and submitting him, that is so unlikely for me. At the end of the day, it's a cage fight to the death. We've always got to, we've always got to just highlight that anything can happen in MMA. Maybe Craig catches Allen with a Hail Mary sub, but we've got to work with most likely outcomes and probabilities here. And if you're asking me for the probability, Paul Craig catches Allen in a submission this weekend, submits him, I'd say less than 10%, which means even at big underdog odds, you're not getting particularly good value on Paul Craig if we deem that's his only realistic way to win. So for me, this is a really bad stylistic matchup for Paul Craig, which makes this a very dead fight for betting, because you can't bet Allen at these odds. The odds are absolutely terrible. There's no upside in betting him. But if you bet Paul Craig outside of something very, very unlikely and improbable happening, I think you're just setting fire to your money. Let me know what you think. Maybe I'm wrong. Like I say, there's a lot of issues with Allen. But stylistically, styles make fights. Stylistically, it's a fucking nightmare matchup for Paul Craig. I think he gets handled this weekend. So let's take a look at the prop bets. Let's take a look. So the over 1.5 rounds is interesting to me in the even money odds range. Obviously, if you look at the records of both guys, it's quite rare they go to a decision. I mean, Allen's fights tend to last a bit longer than Paul Craig's, to be fair. A lot of Craig's fights end pretty quickly, but the over 1.5 rounds is pretty tempting to me, and I might bet it. Obviously, if you're in the Discord group, I will post in the pre-fight betting section. If I do end up taking the over 1.5 rounds, I'll give it a little bit more thought. I am very tempted to pull the trigger on it. The reason why I'm tempted is because styles make fights, and I don't think it's particularly likely that there will be a knockout in this fight. Neither guy is particularly dangerous. If there were to be a knockout, I think it would be Allen knocking Craig out. But it's not easy to knock Craig out, because anytime he runs into trouble on the feet, he just flops to his back or tries to pull guard. We saw it in the Volkan Oezdemir fight where, every time Oezdemir really hurt Craig on the feet, he would just use the old Fabrizio Verdum, Damian Maia tactic, flop to his back. So he's a very difficult fighter to submit. A very difficult fighter to submit because he doesn't engage with you on the feet. And then on the ground, because both guys have got a base in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, I don't think it'll be that easy for either guy to get a submission on the ground either. So if the fight does end, I think it'll probably come a bit later on when Paul Craig gets tired, and then maybe Allen can find a way to get him out of there. So I'm actually maybe talking myself into a bet on the over 1.5 rounds here, and this often happens. What happens is I'll research a fight, and I'll take in all the information from the footage, and I'll think about a bet, and then I'll reflect on it over maybe a few days or a few hours. But then when I come to recording this breakdown video, I'm basically just relaying to you guys, summarizing for you everything that I've seen in the footage, in the research. And when I go back over all the information, all the stuff I've seen, quite often in that process, I'll actually make my mind up that, that is a pretty good bet. I think I probably will take the over 1.5 rounds this weekend. I quite like that. So that's a pretty good bet. I would take that actually, guys. And then if I'll drop it obviously in the Discord for the homies, everyone in the Discord channel. I will drop it in as soon as this video is done. In terms of prop bets, I think the most likely prop is Allen inside the distance, but the odds are terrible, so you can't bet that. So I would give that a miss. So I hope you found that useful. Let me know what you think. I know there's a lot of people on Paul Craig this weekend, so if you're thinking of betting Paul Craig, please leave a comment below. Let me know the reasons why, and why you think I'm wrong, why I should be giving Craig more respect. So now let's break down the co-main event on this card, which is going to be Jake Matthews versus the undefeated Michael Morales. So if we start off by taking a look at the odds on this one, we can see that Morales is one of many big favourites on this card at average odds of around, call it 1.32, which is going to be minus 313 for an implied probability of 76%. If we take a look at the odds on Jake Matthews, he is around an average of 3.50, which is going to be plus 250 for an implied probability of 29%. So Matthews is 29 years old, 5'11", with a 72-inch reach. Morales, 24 years old, 6 foot tall, with a 79-inch reach. So a couple of subtle X factors to dig into here. The first being that Michael Morales is very young, and you can really see that in the way that he fights. He's green, he's inexperienced, and he does make a lot of mistakes. He's very, very raw, which you'd expect for a 24-year-old. It takes time to refine your fighting style. It's just going to take Morales a while to mature as a fighter. And this is one of those fights where I think Jake's age and experience gives him a bit of an edge in that department, because Jake, knows what it's like to feel hurt and tired in fights. He's fought loads of different styles, he's fought all over the world, whereas Morales very much still learning. So it's a tough fight for Morales, and a relatively decent step up in competition as well when you look at the guys that he's been facing. Although, to be fair to him, facing Trevin Giles and Max Griffin in 2 of his first 3 fights in the UFC, I mean, it's not the easiest road. He has fought a couple decent guys already. Now, this is one of those matchups where I am looking forward to seeing the ceremonial weigh-ins so that we can get a look at the face-off, because on paper we can see that Morales has a huge 7-inch reach advantage, and even though it doesn't show that he's that much taller than Matthews, I think when these two actually face off at the ceremonial weigh-ins, the size difference could be pretty big in terms of how physically imposing Morales is, because don't forget, Matthews did fight at lightweight for a while and has now moved up to welterweight, whereas at 6 foot tall with a 79-inch reach, I mean, that's a middleweight wingspan for Morales, and as he gets older and it becomes harder for him to cut weight, he probably will have to move weight class. For now at 24, he can make welterweight. But I think there could be a pretty big size advantage in this fight, and the 7-inch reach advantage for Morales statistically gives him around about a 67% chance of winning. So that's a nice stat, a nice trend going in Morales' favour. Now, this is one of those very unique fights in that if we just look at how these two match up from a technical point of view, skill for skill, what both guys are capable of in terms of just technique alone, I actually think this is one of those matchups where Jake Matthews is better than Morales everywhere. When I look at, both of these guys from a technical point of view, there's nothing that I can really pick out that I think Morales does better than Matthews, which is an interesting position for us to be in, because we can see that Morales is, a pretty big favourite. And if ever we run into a situation where we've got a fighter as a big favourite, just like with Brendan Allen, we'd assume that would mean that from a technical point of view, they have the advantages over their opponent almost everywhere. So this is a bit of a paradox, this fight, because our logical brain would say, well, if Jake Matthews is better than Morales everywhere, and, he's a big underdog, he's an absolute no-brainer bet. But the thing is, I say this a lot, we would all be millionaires if making money betting on MMA was as simple as, just identifying who the more skilled fighter was, who the more technically skilled fighter was, and just betting them. We'd all be millionaires. This would be the easiest sport in the world to bet on. It's very easy to identify who is the more technically skilled fighter. You could train anyone to do that. We know a lot more goes into the outcome of MMA fights, and this matchup is a good example, because what I see from these two is a guy in Jake Matthews that has great footwork, great movement, decent boxing, brilliant leg kicks, nice technical striking, decent offensive wrestling. My criticism of Matthews when it comes to grappling is that his takedown offense isn't great and he's quite weak off his back. But when he's the hammer, when he's the aggressor in grappling positions, he's pretty good. And when you look at Matthews as a package, there's not a whole lot wrong with him, really. He's a pretty well-rounded fighter, which, to be fair, you'd expect for a guy that has been in the UFC since, I believe, he was like 21 years old, maybe even younger than that. I know he was one of the youngest, or he was the youngest Ultimate Fighter winner ever. He might even have been younger than 21. But anyway, I digress. Matthews is a total package, very well-rounded fighter, whereas when you look at Morales, there's a lot of issues there, which you'd expect from a 24-year-old, right? I bet if you were to go back and look at Jake Matthews, footage of Jake Matthews when he was 24, there'd be a lot of issues as well. When we look at Morales' issues, for me, he's one of these guys that is pretty reckless, pretty bad defensively, relies too much on power and athleticism. He loads up a lot on his shots. He doesn't have a particularly efficient style of fighting. His grappling's very raw and green as well, where he does everything with raw athleticism and power. But because he's 24 years old, to some extent he can get away with it. His cardio is pretty good. He's got that young man energy about him, and he's able to get away with it against the level of opponent he's been facing. But now obviously he's facing a step up against Matthews. If he beats Matthews, he'll face another step up, and we're getting to Morales' stage in his career where, unfortunately, even though he's very young, this isn't boxing, and he's not going to be thrown names to kind of build a career and a record off of. Every time he picks up a win, he's going to be facing a better guy. And the question for us is, when is he going to run into that level where he's going to need to have the technical ability to back up his raw athleticism? So I personally don't feel technically he's particularly good. And again, that's not me being... I don't want to be disrespectful to Morales. I would say that about any 24-year-old fighter. It's impossible for a guy this young to be, at a very high level everywhere, because he just hasn't been training for long enough to get to that point. It's just logical, right? So in terms of how these two match up from a stylistic point of view, when it comes to grappling, neither guy is particularly good, but we know Matthews is very weak off his back, and I think this is where Morales can cause him problems with his raw power and athleticism. Morales is one of these guys that doesn't always use as much wrestling as he should. Morales at times uses very grappling heavy game plans and uses a lot of grappling, and then at other times, in his last fight, for example, against Max Griffin, he won't use much grappling at all. If Morales were to come into this fight with a grappling heavy game plan, I think he'd cause Matthews big problems, because Matthews is pretty easy to take down, pretty easy to hold down. And I think with Morales' abundance of physicality and athleticism, he'd be able to hold Matthews down and control him quite easily, rack up a lot of top control, score a lot of points. But based on his last fight against Griffin, he may choose to stand and bang here. And if he does, I think that would be a tactical and strategic error, because I think Matthews could cause him big problems when it comes to striking. Now, I do think Matthews is going to struggle with the size, the physicality, that 7-inch reach advantage that Morales brings to the table. Morales is very aggressive. He likes to come forward, take control of the centre of the octagon, put you on the back foot. But Matthews does have good footwork, does have good movement, has very good leg kicks that he can use to slow Morales down. He's a better boxer than Morales as well. Like we were saying in the Tom Aspinall versus Sergey Pavlovich breakdown video from last weekend, straight punches beat wide punches, and that was the reason why we picked Aspinall to win in that fight. We were showing footage of the difference between Pavlovich's striking and Aspinall's striking, showing that, you know, Aspinall just being faster, more technical, is going to cause Pavlovich big problems, and that's exactly what happened, right? He was just too fast in those exchanges, caught Pavlovich with a big shot and knocked him out. I could see the same thing happening here, because Matthews is a lot more technical, he's going to be a lot more accurate, he's going to be a lot faster than Morales, and this might be one of those fights where Morales really gets punished for his recklessness, because even though Griffin is a pretty good boxer as well, if we look at Griffin's record, he's very much a decisionator. So even though Griffin's boxing's good, you know, he just doesn't really have much power in his hands. You know, he's only got one win by knockout in his last bloody God knows how many fights. So, you know, he did damage Morales in that fight because of how bad Morales' striking defense is, but he doesn't really have the power to really punish Morales, like, you know, drop him or hurt him really bad or knock him out. Matthews does. You know, Matthews doesn't have tons of wins on his record by knockout either, but we know he can hit hard. He is powerful, does have power in his hands, so he could be the first guy to make Morales pay for that bad defense. So, in terms of how I view this fight from a betting point of view, for me it's a really tricky fight, because with Jake Matthews, you've got a guy that is more likely to slow down as the fight wears on. Takedown offense, ground game, you know, not great, very weak off his back, and also has been known to kind of cave mentally in fights and kind of give up. Now, we've also seen him, you know, come out on top in crazy wars, crazy brawls as well, right, where he's had to dig deep and pull through. But Matthews is very much one of these fighters where I feel the mental game is particularly big with him, where sometimes I just feel he's a little bit like Donald Cerrone in that the mental aspect of his game can be lacking at times, and quite often he just doesn't show up. Sometimes he does, sometimes he doesn't, and for that reason he's always a dangerous fighter to bet on. Whereas if you look at someone like Morales, he's much more consistent, he's aggressive, he's mean, he's nasty, he's scrappy. And when I look at these two guys, if I were to bet Michael Morales this weekend, I know that no matter whether he wins or loses, he's absolutely 100% going to show up and do his absolute best to win. With Jake Matthews, I wouldn't feel so confident. You know, he's one of those guys that I don't really trust with my money to perform, because I've seen him underperform so many times throughout his career and make so many mistakes in fights. So this is one of those matchups where, obviously, when you look at the odds, you can't bet Morales. He's too big of a favourite. There's too many issues with him. He is unproven. So the question then becomes, is Matthews worth a gamble? Well, you guys know me. You know my style of betting. I'm very conservative. This conservative approach has enabled us to have a brilliant 2023, to the point where we've only had 2 losing months in this entire year. We hit another big winner on Lupita Godinez last weekend. So betting guys like Jake Matthews is not my style, because I know I'm taking on a lot of risk if I bet Jake Matthews, and when I can make, you know, a nice clean profit on someone like Lupita Godinez last weekend that I know he's going to win pretty comfortably, it then doesn't feel good to me to put, you know, good money at risk that we've worked hard for on a really, really risky bet like Jake Matthews. And I'm not saying betting Jake Matthews this weekend is the wrong thing to do, because everyone's got to walk their own path in life. Everyone's got different betting strategies. Everyone's got a different approach to this game. But for me, when I bet pre-fight, I want to overwhelmingly stack the odds in my favour and bet on the fighter that I know is going to win a very high percentage of the time. You can't say that's the case with Matthews, because he's fighting a big, strong, physically imposing, athletic dude with a 7-inch reach advantage. Could potentially take him down, causing big problems on the ground. And we also know Matthews' fight IQ, strategy, game planning isn't the best. He's inconsistent. So this is one of those fights where if you really want to bet this fight, I do think it's dog or pass. I don't think Matthews is a particularly bad bet. It's just not a bet that I would place, because I know I'm taking on a lot of risk, and more often than not, I think Matthews loses. So if we consider the over-under on this matchup, set at over 1.5 rounds, or the over 2.5, under 2.5 in the even money odds range, for me, personally, I do think it's more likely this fight goes deeper, simply because both guys are reasonably tough. Both guys are difficult to get out of there. If you look at Jake Matthews' record, the majority of his fights go deep. It looks like this fight would have missed cash in the over 1.5 rounds by 6 seconds, I think, or maybe would have cashed by 6. I'm not too sure. Either way, point I'm trying to make, if you look at Jake Matthews' record, the majority of his fights do last more than 7.5 minutes, which would cash the over 1.5 rounds, and same goes for Morales as well. So I think it's quite likely this fight goes deep. Both guys are tough. Both guys are well rounded. If it does end under 1.5 rounds, I think it's more likely Jake Matthews has caught Michael Morales with a big counter shot and knocked him out, like made Morales pay for his bad striking defense in the same way that Aspinall made Pavlovich pay for Pavlovich's bad striking defense. Because in many ways there's a lot of similarities between Morales' striking and Pavlovich's, in that they just come forward with a lot of aggression, winging these big wide hooks. In terms of the prop bets on this one, Matthews by knockout or TKO is interesting to me. I'm not a lover of prop bets, and I won't be betting that myself, but if you do like props and you want to sprinkle a little bit of money on every fight to make watching him more interesting, Matthews by knockout or TKO 10.0 plus 900, I do like that, because of how reckless Morales is, and because Matthews does hit hard. I know he doesn't have tons of wins by knockout, but I wouldn't say walking him down, with the chin up high and exposed, being really reckless, is a particularly smart thing to do. A guy like Matthews can make you pay. So Matthews to win by knockout or TKO, I quite like that as a long shot prop. Not particularly likely to win, probably carries a reasonably good risk to reward ratio. So I hope you found that breakdown useful. So now let's get into the next fight, which is going to be Jordan Leavitt against Chase Hooper. So if we start off by taking a look at the odds on this one, we can see that Hooper is a pretty big favourite at average odds of around 1.49, which is going to be minus 204 for an implied probability of 67%. If we take a look at the odds on Leavitt, he's around an average of 2.75, which is plus 175 for an implied probability of 36%. So Jordan Leavitt is 28 years old, 5'9" with a 71-inch reach, and Chase Hooper is 24 years old, 6'1" with a 74-inch reach. That means that both these guys are in a situation where they do have very different body types. We can see that Hooper's only got a 3-inch reach advantage over Leavitt. This could be one of those matchups where when we see both of them at the ceremonial weigh-ins, the size difference will look absolutely massive, because sometimes when we see a guy that's like 6'1" going up against someone that's 5'9", we can see the guy that is 6'1" absolutely towering over Leavitt. Now, of course, well, not necessarily Leavitt, but over their opponent. Now, of course, whenever we're talking about body types, there are strengths to weaknesses to different body types. And of course, the downside to Hooper's long, lean, skinny frame is that he is quite physically weak. Now, he is getting a lot better in this department. He is bulking up. He's getting a lot stronger. He is more physically imposing than he was in his early UFC fights, but it's obviously still an issue for him. Now, obviously, he's not facing the most athletic, the most physically imposing opponent, facing Jordan Leavitt this weekend, but it's always something you've got to mention when discussing a Chase Hooper fight. Now, I do want to emphasize the fact that I do think Hooper is one of these guys that is making exponential improvements from fight to fight. Of course, we bet him at underdog odds to beat Nick Fury in his last matchup, and he came through for us in a big way. And Hooper's really the only guy that I've been tempted to bet on this weekend's card so far. Still got 5 fights to research on this card, but Hooper's the only one where I've been really close to pulling the trigger, because for me this is another one of those matchups, like Brendan Allen and Paul Craig, that when I sit back and reflect on how these two matchups stylistically and ways in which Leavitt could potentially win, it's just very, very difficult for me to basically see a realistic scenario in which Leavitt could get his hand raised this weekend. Predominantly because they both have very similar styles of fighting, but Hooper is just like that 30 to 40% better than Leavitt everywhere. We used that as our rationale to bet Lupita Godinez to beat Talbott Richie last weekend, where we said, look, there's nothing that Godinez does significantly better than Talbott Richie, but the probability of Richie, knocking out or submitting Godinez is very low. So with Godinez being that 30 to 40% better than Richie everywhere, it's going to be very difficult for Richie to win a decision against a superiorly skilled opponent like Godinez. I really feel that's the case here, because if we look at how these two match up from a stylistic point of view, they're not great when it comes to striking, right? Both are very uncomfortable and awkward on the feet. Both are very bad defensively. I know Leavitt won his last fight by knockout, but that was very low probability, weird, unpredictable thing that happened. Generally speaking, Leavitt very uncomfortable on the feet, very easy to trap on the outside and pressure. And this is one of those matchups where, and I won't say this very often, but this is one of those matchups where I actually think Hooper has a big advantage over his opponent when it comes to striking. Because for me, when you look at the improvements Hooper has made to his striking, he's actually very good at using his length to pepper his opponents with kicks from a range where they have to cover a lot of distance to get inside and counter. Leavitt is quite small, quite compact, and one of these guys that kind of goes into a defensive shell if you cause him a problem on the feet. So I think if Hooper's smart in this one, fights at distance, uses his long kicking game, I think he can hammer Leavitt with kicks and have a lot of success with striking. Now, Hooper's style is generally very similar to Mackenzie Dern's strategy, where he will kind of maraud forward, put a lot of pressure on his opponents, and just look to overwhelm them with chaos. Barrages of punches, peppering them with kicks, in the hope that he will kind of overwhelm them and distract them with strikes, and that they'll give up, they'll make a mistake, give up a cheap takedown. They'll run into a body lock trip takedown, or he can catch a kick, or something crazy will happen. They'll try and take him down to alleviate the pressure he's putting on him, and that's his way of getting the fight to the ground. And that means that it's not that likely he will stand at distance and use his length to pepper Leavitt with kicks. But if I was his coach, strategically I would be telling him to do that, because he's got better cardio than Leavitt, better striking than Leavitt. He's longer, he's taller, his kicking game's quite nice. He's improved it a lot, and that's an area where I feel he has a pretty big edge in this matchup. But of course, we know both these guys are primarily grapplers, and they both want to be on the ground. So you would expect to see a lot of grappling in this fight. And for me, that's another area where Hooper has a big advantage. He's got those long, skinny legs, which means he can, generate a lot of leverage when he's working with different positions, different submission attempts. He's very scrambly, very difficult to control. It's difficult to hold him in one position for very long because he's very scrambly. He's good at creating space for himself to work out of bad positions. He's good at, transitioning, hitting reversals. He's very slick on the ground. He does give up position a lot, and that may present some opportunities to Leavitt. I feel Leavitt probably has the better grappling control out of the two, probably the heavier top game out of the two. But I think Hooper's flexible enough, skilled enough, tricky enough on the ground to cause Jordan Leavitt all kinds of problems. And I think it's just a very good stylistic matchup for Hooper. Like I say, I've been very, very tempted to bet Hooper this week. It's only really his odds putting me off betting him. If his odds were a little bit better, I would pull the trigger. Very difficult for me to bet Hooper at these odds, but I'd be very surprised if Jordan Leavitt got the win this weekend. Of course, Leavitt's wife, partner, girlfriend, I don't know exactly what she is, is also very close to giving birth. That could be a distraction, but we can't really quantify the impact that has on Leavitt's mentality going into this matchup. Maybe it's a distraction which is detrimental to his performance. Maybe it's a huge motivating factor because he needs to earn as much money as possible with a new baby on the way. Very difficult to gauge which way it's going to go, so best not to speculate on it. But yeah, very good stylistic matchup for Hooper, and I'd expect him to win this weekend. In terms of the over-under on this one, it's actually really interesting. So even money odds range for fight to go to a decision or not. Yeah, it is a tricky one because obviously both guys are primarily grapplers, so they should be reasonably good at defending them, themselves on the ground. Having said that, Hooper does like to push a high pace, and Leavitt's cardio isn't great. So if a finish does come, I think it's going to come in the form of basically Leavitt being too tired to defend himself and Hooper submitting him. I do think it's more likely the fight ends inside the distance, but it's not something I would bet on. It's tricky. Because if you look at Hooper's record, his fights frequently go to decisions or deep. And if you look at Jordan Leavitt, it's a bit of a mixed bag, actually. It's tricky, man. It is tricky. It is very tricky. I don't have a strong opinion on the over-under. I would give that a bit of a miss. Quite a hard miss, actually. In terms of the prop bets on this one, I think Hooper by submission is actually the most likely outcome, and I do think it's reasonably likely to happen. I think it'll get to a point where Leavitt is too tired to defend himself and Hooper will put him away with a submission. So if you do want to bet on this fight, sprinkle a little bit of money to make watching it more interesting, I would go for Hooper by decision. Not something I would be betting myself. I don't like props, but I do think that is a reasonably good prop. I thought the odds would be steeper than this. So I hope you found that breakdown useful. If you did, please hit the like button. It would help give this video a big boost in the YouTube search rankings. It would mean a lot to me. I would really appreciate it. Alright, now let's break down the next fight between Peyton Talbott and Nick Aguirre. Peyton Talbott making his UFC debut. He's only had 6 pro fights, but he looks very, very good, which is the reason why he is one of the biggest favourites on the card. It is extremely rare that you see a debutant in the UFC in this odds range. It is even more rare that the debutant is coming in after only having 6 pro fights, which kind of speaks to how good Talbott looks, but obviously he's very unproven, and so the odds, I guess, are a little bit ridiculous based on that. But we'll obviously talk about how these two match up from a stylistic point of view. So Talbott is around a 1.13 favourite, which is minus 769 for an implied probability of 89%. And we can see that Aguirre is the underdog at average odds of around 6.25, which is going to be plus 525 for an implied probability of 16%. So Talbott is 25 years old, 5'10" with a 70-inch reach. Aguirre, 27 years old, 5'9" with a 74-inch reach. So we can see both guys roughly the same age, roughly the same size, but Mr. Aguirre has a nice 4-inch reach advantage, and he's also had the benefit of having a fight in the UFC against Dan Argueta, whereas Talbott, of course, making his UFC debut. Now, it's a very tricky situation for me, this, because when you look at footage of Peyton Talbott, he looks amazing. He looks like one of these guys that really doesn't have any weaknesses in his game at all. His cardio looked very good because we've seen him go deep a few times. His Contender Series fight went the distance. Striking looks very technical. He moves very well. He's good defensively. Everything about his striking is very tight. We were saying in the Michael Morales versus Jake Matthews breakdown that young guys tend to be very green, very inexperienced, very raw. My nose has gone really itchy. I do apologize, guys. Yeah, when we were breaking down Michael Morales, we were talking about how young guys, always have big weaknesses, right? Because they just haven't been training long enough to tighten everything up and be, a very well-rounded, complete fighter. That's what is very unique about Talbott, because he does look like a very unique fighter. Now, obviously, he's only faced a low level of opponent. He hasn't really been tested yet. But in terms of the skills he's demonstrated in his fights so far, he looks very, very good to me. To the extent that it's kind of difficult to talk about this fight, because he does look significantly better than Nick Aguirre everywhere. His grappling is solid, takedown defense solid, cardio great, moves well on the feet, very technical. He's a bit of an outlier in the sense that, when you look at footage of someone like Michael Morales, who's only a year younger than Talbott, you can see he's very green, he's very raw, and there's a lot of issues from a technical point of view. When you look at Talbott, there's really no issues at all. He's very, very good. So in terms of how these two match up stylistically, for me, Talbott significantly better than Aguirre everywhere. Much, 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 much better striker, much more technical. Great cardio, decent grappling. Very difficult fight for Aguirre, this. I would not expect this to be competitive, but then, maybe Talbott's one of these guys that looks great against a low level of opponent and will struggle now he starts to face a step up. But, for me, Talbott looks really, really good. So if we look at how the over-under is checking out on this matchup, favoured not to go to a decision. That is pretty interesting. That is pretty interesting, because what I will say about Talbott is he doesn't look all that dangerous. He's just very well-rounded and skilled, but it's not like he has big power or anything like that. He's more of a volume striker. Aguirre showed that he was very tough in his debut against Dan Argueta. I don't have a strong feeling on the over-under, because we haven't seen tons of footage on these two against a reasonably good level of opponent, so I'm not going to be betting the over-under, but my lean would be this fight going deeper as opposed to ending quickly, just by how they match up stylistically from the footage that I've seen. In terms of props, I need to see a bit more of Talbott to be able to have a strong opinion on really specific outcomes such as prop bets. So I don't really have a feeling on props with this matchup. So let's move on. And let's break down the fight between Amanda Ribas and Luana Pinheiro. Now, if we start off by taking a look at the odds on this one, we can see that Ribas is the favourite at average odds of around 1.41, which is going to be minus 244 for an implied probability of 71%. We take a look at the odds on Pinheiro. She is around an average of 2.90, which is going to be plus 190 for an implied probability of 34%. So Ribas is 30 years old, 5'3", with a 66-inch reach, and Pinheiro, 29 years old, 5'4", with a 62-inch reach. So both girls roughly the same age. We can see that Pinheiro is giving up a 4-inch reach, so Ribas has a 4-inch reach advantage in this fight. Doesn't do a particularly good job of using it, but it's better to have a reach advantage than not to have a reach advantage. So that will help Ribas a little bit on the feet, which is significant, because I do feel this is an area where Pinheiro could cause her problems. If the fight stays standing, Pinheiro may be able to do reasonably well here. So, in terms of how these two match up when it comes, or in terms of how these two match up stylistically, I guess let's start off with striking, right? So, Ribas has a real issue with her striking in that she kind of falls apart when she gets hurt. So she's one of these fighters that moves very well, very confident, is reasonably technical at the beginning of the fight, but the more you hurt her, the more damage you inflict on her, the sloppier she gets and the worse her defense and striking becomes. It's not something you see a whole lot of as a trait in the UFC, but it's definitely true of Ribas, and this is why we see her lose so many fights where she takes damage early. Like if you cut Ribas bad early in round 1 or you bust her nose in round 1, she just doesn't perform anywhere near her potential in the rounds 2 and 3. If she doesn't take that much damage, she can perform reasonably well over the 3 rounds. Now Pinheiro isn't particularly dangerous on the feet, doesn't have much power on her hands, but she's reasonably technical. You can see her, you know, kicking the heavy bag here. She is, I would say, I mean, she's a reasonably well-rounded fighter, to be fair, but I would say she is primarily a striker. And in terms of how these two match up when it comes to striking, I think it's pretty even. Ribas does throw a higher volume of strikes, but doesn't really land with much impact. She's quite slight, she's quite feminine, she's not that athletic or physically imposing, she doesn't hit very hard. So Ribas throws more volume than Pinheiro, but Pinheiro lands the harder, more damaging strikes. That's not to say that Pinheiro hits particularly hard, but she hits harder than Ribas. So this is kind of damage and impactfulness versus the volume of Ribas, which for me makes this quite a competitive fight on the feet. I don't see a huge advantage when it comes to striking for either girl. Now, when it comes to grappling, Ribas has got a really heavy top game. We haven't seen very much of Pinheiro's ground game, her takedown offense or anything like that, because the vast majority of her fights before she came to the UFC ended very quickly. And then in her last 2, the takedown offense hasn't really been tested in the way that Ribas is going to test it. So we don't know what the chances of Ribas executing a grappling heavy game plan, having success with it in this matchup is going to be. What we do know is that Ribas has got a very heavy top game. What we also know is that Ribas's offensive wrestling isn't great. Most of her takedown attempts come from like judo throws, hip tosses, head and arm throws, things like that. You don't really see her shoot traditional single legs, double legs very often. She does occasionally, but it's not that common. So it's difficult to gauge how this fight is likely to go without really knowing anything about Pinheiro's takedown offense and ground game, because if Pinheiro's able to keep this fight standing, I think it's going to be razor close. But if Pinheiro's takedown defense turns out to be really bad, then Ribas could get her down and dominate her from top position in a similar way that she did to Viviane Araújo. So it's a tricky fight from that perspective, and for that reason, very dangerous to bet. It's very, very tricky. I'm not interested at all in betting this fight, because for me, you know, with how much Ribas struggles in fights when she gets hurt, I wouldn't bet her as a big favourite. She caves too easily when she takes damage. But on the flip side, you can't bet Pinheiro, because for all we know, her takedown offense and ground game is an absolute joke. And if it is, Ribas is skilled enough to cause her big problems on the ground. We know Ribas got really heavy top game, really good grappling control. This fight is an easy pass for me. In terms of the over-under, obviously it's favoured that the fight will go to a decision. I mean, to be fair, most strawweight fights do go to a decision. The lighter weight classes are less likely to see finishes. So yeah, I guess I would agree with that. You can see that Ribas, bit of a decisionator, with 3 of her last 4 going to a decision. Both Pinheiro's fights in the UFC have also gone to a decision. So yeah, you might want to consider betting on this fight to go to a decision. For me personally, I'm not going to, because I would be concerned that Pinheiro has no ground game, and if the fight goes to the ground, Ribas just ties her up in knots, dominates her, submits her. So that would prevent me from betting the fight to go to a decision at favourite odds, but I think that's the more likely outcome. In terms of prop bets, I suppose Ribas by decision, but her odds are absolutely dreadful. So I would give that one a miss for sure. So I hope you found that useful. Now let's break down the final fight on this card. In fact, the fight that was only announced this week between Uros Medic and, I don't even want to try and pronounce this first name, Miktabek Orolbai. Probably completely butchered that. I'm sure loads of people in the comments are going to try and tell me how to pronounce that. I really apologise for getting it wrong. Anyway, what's interesting about this fight is that, again, one of those very rare situations where a debutant is the favourite. We saw it with Mr. Peyton Talbott, and we've got it here with Orolbai as a favourite over Medic, which is very interesting for a few reasons. Not overly surprised by Talbott being a favourite over Aguirre, because, well, Aguirre's only had one fight in the UFC, mostly unproven, but Medic is pretty bloody good. Has some good wins over some good UFC level guys. So when I went into watching footage on Orolbai this weekend, I was like, oh, he's got to be pretty special to be a favourite over Medic on less than a week's notice in his UFC debut. Let's talk about it and see if it's justified. So Orolbai is the favourite at average odds of around 1.69. It's going to be minus 145 for an implied probability of 59%. We take a look at the odds on Medic. He's around an average of 2.20, which is going to be plus 120 for an implied probability of 45%. So Medic, 30 years old, 6'1", with a 71-inch reach. Orolbai, 25 years old, 5'10". Don't know what his reach is, so don't have a lot of information to work with in terms of the tail of the tape. What we do know is that Orolbai is coming into the UFC on less than a week's notice, with Medic originally scheduled to face Mr. Johnny Parsons, that pulled out at some point this week. And like I say, I'm not sure there's any inside information on this one. Let me know if you've heard anything. Was Orolbai scheduled to face someone else soon, or was he training to face someone else in a different promotion soon? He did fight, a few weeks ago, so hopefully he's still in pretty good shape. But he is taking this fight on less than a week's notice, and it's quite rare guys perform well when they fight on less than a week's notice. In fact, it's extremely rare. So the fact that Orolbai is the favourite over a tough guy like Medic less than a week's notice, I find that very interesting. Now, where do we even begin with this one? It's quite a complicated fight, actually. What I would say about Orolbai is, when you look at footage of him, you can tell that he is very well trained. He moves reasonably well on the feet, and his MMA grappling is very technically sound. He understands the importance of position over submission, doesn't try to do anything crazy on the ground, just looks to control you, beat you up on the ground, nothing fancy, which I like quite a lot. Doesn't have the most physically imposing style of grappling, but very technically sound, and because he's not that physically imposing, that's probably the reason why his cardio's look reasonably good in past fights as well. What makes this a particularly difficult fight to predict, though, is that Orolbai is one of these fighters that looks very skilled, very well-rounded, and very well-trained, but he's fought a very low level of opponent that haven't really offered up any resistance at all. So the kind of guys that Orolbai has been facing are the kind of guys that will literally give up every single takedown attempt that he shoots at them. So he's never really been forced to work particularly hard for takedowns, and when he does get guys down, they don't really know how to work their way back up to their feet. So he can hold them down very easily without taking any damage, without worrying about being reversed, without having to exert much energy to hold them down. So it's one of those fights where Orolbai looks very sound and very well rounded against a very low level of opponent. And my question would be, how will Orolbai look when he runs into someone that can make him work hard for takedowns or scramble back up to their feet once he takes them down? And we don't have the answer to that question. So the question really is Uros Medic that guy? And unfortunately, we don't have the answer to that, because whereas there's gaps in information with Orolbai, where we haven't really seen him face a particularly good level of opponent to assess really how capable he is on the ground. With Uros Medic, the problem is, we just haven't really seen him face any grapplers. We haven't really seen him defend takedowns. We haven't really seen him on his back or held down. So we don't really know what his chances are of keeping this fight standing and stuffing Orolbai's takedowns, or working his way back up to his feet when he does get taken down. The reason why I'm guessing Orolbai is a favourite in this is because we have seen a couple fights now where Medic has slowed. It happened against Jalen Turner, and it also happened against Matthew Semmelsberger, although he was able to dig deep and get the win in round 3. So we know that Medic is a guy that will slow down, and he will slow down in stand-up fights. And so the reason why I think Orolbai is a favourite here is, you know, if Orolbai starts shooting takedowns, trying to get Medic down, wearing on him in the clinch, that will obviously tire Medic out. And since Medic is a guy that's already slowed in fights, as long as Orolbai doesn't get knocked out early, that obviously, you know, increases the probability that Orolbai will tire Medic out, take over in the second half of the fight. However, does to me look like Medic is a significantly better striker than Orolbai. So, you know, it's a tricky one. You know, if Medic shows up with reasonably good takedown offense, 3 rounds of cardio, Orolbai could be in a lot of trouble here. And again, the question is, I know Orolbai fought a few weeks ago, but how will he look on less than a week's notice, right? So it's a bit of a tricky fight, bit of a minefield of a fight, and a lack in information and footage with both guys makes it difficult to feel really confident on either side. I guess my lean's Orolbai. I don't feel particularly confident either way. Orolbai, based on the fact that we've seen Medic slow. Orolbai's cardio's looked great in the past. He fought a few weeks ago. I think that persistent grappling that he's brought into his matchups against past opponents will likely wear Medic out. But I don't feel particularly confident about picking a guy coming on less than a week's notice. So I don't really have a super strong opinion on this matchup at all. Because this fight was only announced this week, I don't think we've got props on best fight odds for it yet. And we don't have props or anything like that, so we can't talk about them. So I hope you found that useful. Thank you very much for watching. If you did find this useful, please consider checking out my website, MMABettingTips.com. Link in the description below, where if you found value in these breakdown videos for the main card fights, you'll find breakdown videos for all the prelim matchups over on my website. And yeah, check it out. Hit the like button if you haven't already. It would help a lot, actually. It would really help boost this video's rank in YouTube. And subscribe if you haven't already. Nice one, guys. Take care. I will see you all with another breakdown video very soon. Nice one, guys. Bye.